Good afternoon, everyone. Are these on? Yes, they are. Fabulous. Welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm just putting my phone on silent, as should you. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, and I am thrilled, frankly, to be convening this meeting with good colleagues, good guests, and particularly with my co-editor and leader of this project, Zerman Zedelmeier. We're talking about today our book, Facing Up to Low Productivity Growth. This is the culmination, not just this book, but of 3.5 years plus of pretty serious research here at the Peterson Institute, where we started out, I think, a little ahead of the curve in telling people that, unfortunately, productivity growth was likely to remain slow as a trend in the US and in the advanced economies. Obviously, there were other people here as well in the world talking about this. Our vice chair of the board, Larry Summers, of course, with his famous secular stagnation formulation. And now reality has caught up with the rest of the world, and the world has caught up with us. And we've seen the official sector and private sector forecasts now taking into account the assumption of relatively low productivity growth going forward. This is one of those many occasions in the economic policy world where one takes no pleasure in being right. This is not a happy outcome. That being this case, however, it's not enough to simply say productivity growth is lower, the world's going to grow less, that's it. The issue is, how does it matter? Given the existence of various institutions such as pension systems, monetary policy arrangements, given the prevalence of inequality that we've seen rising in wage terms in recent years, particularly in the US, how does this play out? Given the dependence, or the interdependence, I should say, of emerging markets and trading partners around the world with the countries at the technological frontier, how does this play out? These are all critical questions for policy, for investors and businesses, for workers. And that is what we set out to tackle with this project. And I think what we're going to be presenting today gives a unique and forward-looking preparation now that people have accepted the reality of what we can do about it. As my colleague Jeremy Zedelmeier nicely formulated, I think he and I would put it, there are two main messages from this research program. The first is, even though the slower productivity growth effects will primarily be negative, it's not always through the channels you think, and it's not always in the way you think. And in particular, we're delighted to have our colleague Karen Dinan here presenting on fiscal policy, who will be talking in particular about some of the subtle and sometimes counterintuitive but important ways that the shifts in productivity growth affect long-term issues of fiscal policy, welfare state sustainability, and public debt. It also has interesting questions for the convergence of emerging markets on the developing world, on the developed world, and trade flows. My colleague, Jeremy Zedelmeier, who, as I mentioned, was the leader of this project with my help, will be presenting on those issues. And we're very thrilled to be bringing back to the Peterson Institute someone who you'll be hearing a lot more about in future years, Anna Stansbury, currently a doctoral student at Harvard. She presented at our conference on this topic previously and is doing fabulous work on inequality. And she will be taking you through some of the issues and the policy implications of the productivity slowdown for inequality. Again, it clearly doesn't make the world a better place, but it's more important to think through how that happens. So our first contribution, I think, is to be ahead of the curve in telling people that you can't just say it's bad. You got to think how bad in which ways. The second main message we would like to talk about is policy implications, because facing up to low productivity growth is not just recognizing the reality, it's what do you do about it. And to use a climate change concept, what we're really talking about is adaptation rather than mitigation. that, yes, it would be nice if analogous to geoengineering and carbon capture and storage, we could reverse the productivity growth trend overnight. It's possible that may happen, in which case, as my grandmother would say, we should be so lucky. But assuming it does not, the idea is how to adapt to a world like this. But I think the important point we would like to say is there turns out really to be no tension really between seeking to mitigate and seeking to adapt. Because most of the policies, or at least a strong subset of the policies that can be adopted in the face of low productivity growth, are ones that serve a dual purpose. If the trend is truly exogenous, this helps us adapt. If normal economics tells us some things that can help us along with productivity growth, these policies will also contribute to that. And that is the direction in which we want to move the public debate and hope you will help us do things. Finally, let me say a word about causes. So most of the discussion about productivity growth for the last several years has been taking one of two lines or both, that either debating measurement issues and saying, well, this is exaggerated, or this isn't yet proven, or we shouldn't take it for granted. I think the accumulation of time series evidence at some point gets you past that, but Karen Dinan and a contributor to this volume, Louis Shaner from across the street, I think did a very good paper on measurement issues and productivity growth, 6 months ago now? Let us just say, for purposes of this argument, because it's right, you can't make this problem go away with measurement claims. The second issue that comes up repeatedly, which is far more, I think, intellectually viable, is to talk about causes. Is this something that is demand relevant? Is this something having to do, as our colleagues at our cousins at the Peterson Foundation might talk about, having to do with demographic issues? Is this an exogenous technology slowdown of the sort that Robert Gordon would speak about? There is room for debate. But what I am also going to say today is, for purposes of this discussion, but also, frankly, I think you should, for purposes of thinking going forward, think about this as some form of exogenous technology slowdown. Prima facie, the argument is very straightforward. We have seen the productivity growth trend decline significantly in both economic and statistical terms in essentially all the advanced economies simultaneously. It has declined by the same order of magnitude in them simultaneously. Differences in how they suffered through the crisis and how they responded to the crisis had very little to do with the extent and variation of how much this productivity decline occurred. That, combined with the fact that we've now gone through several years of relatively good growth, low interest rates, better prospects, and not seeing the uptick in either productivity or investment, makes a very, to my mind, compelling case that we should take this as a technology-driven, a more global phenomenon, and not the mistake of underinvestment or policy, and not the lingering overhang of the crisis, at least not in some temporary sense. And so finally, let me say thank you to a major donor to the Institute who did exactly what we sometimes hope donors do besides be generous. Come to us with an insight and push us to think about it. And that's Robert D. Ziff. Robert Ziff, as long as 5-6 years ago, he's a known tech investor, was raising with me and some other people the idea that the technological rate of progress had slowed down. And he had raised this from his bottom-up perspective of investing in tech independently of the Robert Gordon line of thought, independently of the Larry Summers secular stagnation line of thought. And the point is, all of these very smart, independent thinking individuals all saw the straws in the wind and came to it differently. And we're grateful to the Robert D. Ziff Foundation and to Daniel Ziff, as well as Robert Ziff, for encouraging us first to do the conference where we looked at productivity growth slowdown, and then to do the work on this project. So that's where we are. Let us now go through the real meat of the exercise, which is, again, how productivity growth slowdown will make change in specific areas of policy concern, and how policies responses should think about acting to adapt to this different world. Let's start with Karen Dinan, followed by Jeremy Zettelmeyer and Anna Stansbury. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Adam, and I want to congratulate Jeremy and Adam and the rest of my colleagues at Peterson on putting out this book. It really is a great project, and I was honored to be part of it. I'm going to talk to you about the fiscal implications of lower productivity growth. I just want to start by kind of listing the effects of lower productivity growth that are going to matter in terms of fiscal implications. So to start, lower productivity growth is going to produce larger budget deficits. I'll talk you through that in a second. Lower productivity growth is going to result in lower wage growth, and lower productivity growth is going to result in lower equilibrium interest rates. Okay, so let me start with budget deficits, and I'm going to show you a couple of charts from the Shaner chapter of the book that help illustrate the point. So this chart shows you the primary deficit relative to GDP. And what you can see here in the dark line, that's the CBO baseline forecast for the deficit relative to GDP. You can see it gets a little bit larger, a little more negative over the next 35 years. But the blue line shows you what happens if productivity growth is 0.6 of a percentage point lower per year. And what you can see is that it makes the situation measurably worse. You can see a much larger increase in the budget deficit over the next 35 years. Now, here's a graph that shows you how it translates into the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so first point here is that the CBO baseline forecast, that's the black line, the lowest line. You can see it is indeed climbing a bunch over the next 35 years. But then if you compare that to the darkest of the blue lines, that's kind of the all else equal version when you have the lower productivity growth, 0.6 of a percentage point. So you can see much steeper trajectory. You end up with debt to GDP being close to 175% by 2042, as compared to around 130% in the baseline. Okay, so lower productivity growth makes the debt to GDP situation worse. Second point is that lower interest rates that our models tell us should accompany lower productivity growth, that will help some. Okay, so the next darkest blue line, the third highest line, that's what you get when interest rates decline 1-for-1 by 0.6 percentage points. Okay, but it makes the situation better, but what you can see is that even with a very aggressive decline in interest rates, 1.2 percentage points, okay, that's a 2-for-1, you can see that the debt to GDP ratio is still worse than in the baseline, considerably so, when you've got the lower productivity growth. Okay, so let me talk about implications for fiscal policy. I'm going to start with the larger budget deficits. Okay, so here's where some thinking has evolved over the last couple of years. So there's been recent research, including by my colleague Olivier Blanchard here at Peterson, showing that debt has small costs right now, given current low interest rates. And I think this is a good point, and we're seeing kind of more and more papers to back that up. Okay, that said, you still can't have debt to GDP rising infinitely, or you're not going to have low interest rates. So the implication there is that the lower productivity growth means the rising debt to GDP ratio means that we're going to need to raise more tax revenue than we otherwise would. And the lower productivity growth just means that we need to do even more of that. Okay, so more tax revenue. I don't think there's a lot of scope for cutting discretionary spending in a way that would be meaningful, given that it's already so squeezed. Okay, but it does increase the likelihood of cuts to income support and healthcare programs for older Americans. So there's another fiscal implication, which is that we're going to need more retirement savings incentives so that people have more private saving to bolster their economic security in a world with lower productivity growth. Okay, going on with implications, lower wage growth. The research has that's looked at why labor force participation has declined amongst working age Americans has identified lower wage growth as a cause of that. So with yet lower productivity growth, we can expect to see even lower wage growth. So that does raise the possibility that we'll see even lower labor force participation, which would be bad for the people themselves, would be bad for social cohesion, and it will be bad for our budget situation. So this makes a case for more fiscal incentives to work. Okay, so along those lines, you probably want to target either the groups that we're most concerned about, expand the EITC, or the groups that are most responsive to tax incentives to work. So subsidies to childcare might motivate more second earners to come into the market. Lower interest rates. Well, I already showed you that they do have actually a mitigating effect on the budget situation. Okay, but they have effects on the scope for countercyclical monetary policy. With the Fed up against the zero lower bound, lower interest rates mean that conventional monetary policy will be even more limited than it already is. And this makes the argument for fiscal policy to do more of the heavy lifting when it comes to countercyclical policy. And one of the lessons of recent years is that we have seen political will as an obstacle to using countercyclical fiscal policy or discretionary countercyclical policy. So this argues that in a world where we don't have as much as political will as we'd like to use these tools, what we need is more and better automatic stabilizers in the system. Okay, so so far, everything I said has kind of taken the lower productivity growth as a given. I've been in the adaptation world, as Adam would say, not the mitigation world. And that was the assignment. But I don't really feel like I can close without saying something about whether we can use fiscal policy in ways that will boost productivity. Okay, and here the answer, I think, is yes, in principle, with those last two words being important. If we did truly pro-growth tax reform, if we made investments in infrastructure, education, research, we could make a difference and materially raise productivity growth. Okay? The complication is that yes in principle doesn't mean yes in practice. And I do think it will be much more difficult to achieve this goal in practice. And I think the 2017 Tax Act is a good illustration of the difficulty in doing so. Okay, people recognize that tax reform was a good opportunity to try to put pro-growth policy in place, but as the chart that I'm showing you here, which shows you estimates from various academic or academic-like studies that looked at the effect of the tax reform on growth over the longer term, you can see very small effects. Okay, so the first bar, the kind of midpoint there is below 0.1% per year. So small potatoes relative to what we think has been kind of the decline in trend productivity growth. Limited scope for tax reform. I will just say, it would be great if we lived in a world where we'd see investments in infrastructure, investments in research, investments in people. But even the most promising of those, infrastructure, where you do see bipartisan political support, actually, or at least in words, you really aren't seeing any action. So there too, I think the in principle is more bearish than the in practice view. Okay, so that completes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Great. So thank you so much, Adam, for the great introduction, and thanks so much, Karen, for laying out, what is a lot of the beef of the book. So I guess we had a sort of implicit rule that if you are an author and you're more than 5,000 miles away, we wouldn't make you fly here for the presentation. So I'm the one that benefits from that because I get to present the themes covered in 2 chapters of the book by José de Gregorio from the University of Chile and PIE, who is based in Chile, and then by a team of European authors that look at the international implications. So if you look a little bit, if you try to sort of apply some of the ideas that Karen just raised, right off the bat, without sort of thinking very deeply, I think you can point out 2 international implications of persistently lower productivity growth that have to do with interest rates and capital flows. And so these are based on the premise that if you are an emerging market, or maybe if you are sort of a small open economy that, where growth follows its own logic, you may not be as affected by the productivity growth slowdown in advanced countries as those advanced countries, right? So let's keep that. Whether that premise is true or not is a question in itself, which José de Gregorio looks at in his chapter. But if you accept that premise for a second, then there might actually be some good news for you, because you are going to benefit from lower world interest rates, which, since your growth is assumed to go down by less, if at all, is going to help your debt sustainability. You're also going to get more capital inflows as investors search for yield, which is going to be very low in advanced countries. And that can be good and bad. It's good if it's used for investment. It's bad if it fuels bubbles. Now, on trade, however, the implications are really much less clear. And the reason is that whether or not you would expect more or less trade depends on whether the productivity slowdown will tend to reduce the tail of firms that are sufficiently productive to overcome the fixed costs of exporting. So this is sort of a well-known idea in international trade. And so that's in that chart that you see there, that would be the tail to the right of the red dotted line, or whether the fact that median productivity, everything else is shifting to the left, is going to reduce that tail. So it's sort of unclear, and the reason why it's unclear is particularly because there are several studies that are arguing that what's driving the reduction in median productivity growth of firms is not so much the behavior of the productive firms and the top, but it's the slower growth of productivity of the less productive firms. So this is sort of a truly open empirical question. And so we have one chapter that basically looked at this question in great detail using firm-level data. So this is by a team of 4 European authors, actually not just 4 European authors, they all happen to be Italian for some reason. Filippo Di Mauro, who is based at the National University of Singapore, Bernardo Motironi, Gianmarco Ottaviano, who are at LSE, and Alessandro Zona Mattioli, who is at the European Central Bank. And so they look at, in a very extensive firm-level data set called the CompNet data set. And they conclude, and it's pretty unambiguous, that we're going to see a reduction in export growth. And the argument is that empirically, there is in fact a positive relationship between the productivity of the median firm in their data set and the share of exporting firms, both across countries and over time. And so slower productivity growth should lead to slower export growth, but not to an absolute decline. So all else equal, you would assume slower trade growth. Now, again, there is a little bit of hope that is associated with mitigating policies. So they go to great lengths in this paper to show that the area, if you like, under that tail on the right depends on policies, and particularly it depends on policies that allow reallocation within countries, that allow labor and capital to move towards the more productive firms. And so they compute the effect that you might get if countries move to best practices on these reallocation beneficial policies. So these are policies that would benefit entry and exit of firm, increase competition, make it easier for labor to move. Interestingly, these are policies that would also, as you will see in the next presentation, mitigate some of the consequences of the productivity slowdown, namely on inequality. Anna will talk about that. But here they sort of push these policies as a way of resisting the productivity slowdown. Now, the bad news is that this would be a one-off effect, right? So you can only do sort of a one-off bundle of policies, but of course the slower productivity growth translates into permanently slower export growth. And, the worry is that to the extent that you also think that slower productivity growth has something to do with less international trade, less international competition, there is, of course, a worry that these things feed into each other. So we're getting into a trap here unless we very forcefully resist it. So all I've said so far was under this premise, well, maybe emerging markets are different. Maybe they will resist the trend. And so again, whether or not you think this is likely to be true is an empirical question. And so we have another chapter by José de Gregorio that looks at this empirical question in significant detail. And what he does mainly in the chapter is to look at sort of the past history of productivity catch-up or lack of emerging markets with advanced countries. And so here the story is really summarized in that chart. Let me see if that works. So the broken lines are just GDP growth. So this is not per capita, it's not productivity, it's plain GDP growth. And so here, the stylized fact is that since 1955, when this data set starts, this is from the Penn World Tables, you have had emerging markets consistently grow above advanced countries, right? So there is some catch-up. As it turns out, however, this catch-up is entirely driven by capital and labor as factors, so factor accumulation, and also human capital. And so if you strip out the pure productivity effect, which economists refer to as total factor productivity, TFP, you see that in the lower two lines. And so here, the stunning fact that he uncovers in his paper is that this red line, which is the TFP growth of emerging markets, has since the early 1970s or mid-1970s been consistently lower than that in advanced countries, with the exception of the very recent past, which in fact coincides with the breakdown of advanced country productivity growth, right? So that phenomenon here is essentially what is motivating this entire project. However, the bad news is that even in this very recent period, although at the moment productivity growth on average in emerging market is higher than in advanced countries, you can see that it's highly correlated. And in fact, it's highly correlated roughly starting here, right? So in this early period, which is associated with independence of many developing countries and a phase where you still had extremely high productivity growth in advanced countries, you do not have much correlation at all. Starting about here, you have a lot of correlation, and the correlation really kicks in this new phase. And so, that sort of leaves you with a pessimistic conclusion, which is, in fact, emerging markets may not be able to buck the trend. And so, from a perspective of a policymaker in developing countries, my take would be that what's going on, without knowing much about that country, without what's going on in advanced countries right now and in the world right now with productivity is probably going to be bad for you. But if you manage to have very strong policies, for example, policies that can deal with capital inflows, that can contain private and public debt, even though interest rates are very low, that can create business dynamism. So even though your productivity growth might be coming down, it remains above that of advanced countries. If you can do all these things, maybe this episode of economic history offers a real opportunity for you. So you might come out certainly better in relative terms compared to advanced countries, and maybe better in absolute terms as well. That was all. Thank you.
Thanks, I'm really pleased to be here. I'll be talking about inequality, as Adam outlined. Particularly, I'll be talking about two questions. What are the implications of continued low productivity growth for inequality? And I'll be summarizing in this section the implications from the work that Larry Summers and I did and the work that Jason Furman and Peter Orszag did in the book we're launching today. And then, how should these affect our policy decisions on inequality? So to start with the implications. Arguably, the defining fact of inequality in the US in the last 4 or 5 decades is the decline in the relative incomes of typical workers. This is one way to illustrate it. You can see that median and production and non-supervisory workers' pay has grown much more slowly relative to labor productivity. A natural question that this graph might suggest is, does productivity growth still benefit typical workers? And that is the premise under which Larry Summers and I wrote our paper. This graph illustrates our results. It shows that despite labor productivity having diverged from typical workers' pay in levels, in fact, the growth rates are very closely linked. You can see that in periods of higher productivity growth, there's substantially higher pay growth for typical workers. Numerically, we estimate that about 1% higher productivity growth corresponds to about 0.5% to 1% higher pay growth for median and production and non-supervisory workers. The general takeaway is positive. Productivity growth still passes through to typical workers' pay. But the takeaway for this particular session is not positive. If we're assuming that we'll be in a future of low productivity growth, that implies we'll also be in a future of lower pay growth for typical workers. In fact, if you apply the estimates that we have in our paper, and you have 1% a year labor productivity growth, which is about what we've seen in the last decade, that would imply likely pay stagnation, no growth in real terms in pay for typical workers. Jason Furman and Peter Orszag's paper posits a common cause for the decline in productivity growth and the rise in inequality. They argue that reduced competition and dynamism is characterizing recent years in the US economy. They document a declining entry rate of firms, declining job creation, declining labor mobility, declining success of young firms. They document rises in industrial concentration, and they document an increased dispersion in the success of firms, with the most profitable firms pulling rapidly away from the rest. All of these facts, they argue, are compatible with a decline in competition in the US economy, which, by leading to less investment and less innovation, would result in lower productivity growth and would also result in rising inequality. So to take the implication for the future, if reduced competition and dynamism continue, then we can expect both lower productivity growth and faster rising inequality. So not particularly cheery implications. Low productivity growth implies slow growing or stagnant pay for typical workers, likely faster rising inequality, and less total resources to distribute. It's worth noting that fast productivity growth would not have solved the inequality problems that we face, but it would have given us much more to work with. So I'll take these implications, and I've put together 5 principles of inequality policy in an era of low productivity growth. These principles are not meant to be hard and fast rules about what policymakers should do. Rather, they're meant to be directional. So taking your set of policy preferences around inequality as given, how should you adjust them? In which direction should you move if you think that we'll be in a world of really slow productivity growth? I'll argue first that productivity growth should be a particular priority even when we're thinking about policies to reduce inequality, and that there are a number of double dividend policies which can both improve on both margins. Since resource constraints will bind more tightly, I'll argue that we have to be realistic that hard choices about redistribution will have to be made, and that it should weigh in favor of targeted benefits over universal benefits. And finally, that multiple policy levers should be used, specifically focusing on pre-distribution, not just redistribution, and focusing particularly on dignity, justice, and other measures of non-monetary well-being alongside monetary outcomes. Let's start with principle 1, double dividend policies. Now, it's common in economic policy to have a trade-off between efficiency and equity, but actually, there are a number of policies in today's economy which could result in improvements on both margins. They can reduce inequality and increase productivity growth. Since we know that productivity growth is important in raising the pay of typical workers, and we know that there are vast proportions of society who are excluded from opportunities to fulfill their talent and their potential, that is the first bucket of policies on which we can improve on both margins. Reducing barriers to workforce participation, particularly through criminal justice reform, which will reduce the proportion of people, particularly of African American men who are incarcerated, predominantly for minor offences, would not only enable people to rejoin the labour force, but also to enter the kind of jobs at which they can fulfil their productive potential more. Paid parental leave and childcare support similarly enable women to re-enter the workforce and to enter the jobs at which they can fulfill their productive potential. Reducing barriers to labour mobility can increase dynamism. For example, ensuring that workers don't lose their health benefits when they leave their jobs, reducing occupational licensing requirements or land use restrictions that mean that workers can't move into the occupations or the cities at which they would be most productive. Increasing access to education, somewhat obviously, but important to emphasize, particularly access to quality schools in disadvantaged neighborhoods and early childhood education. And increasing competition, increasing antitrust enforcement and ensuring that barriers to entry for new firms are not too high. Now, Adam said at the beginning of this session that we are looking to adapt and not to mitigate. So I appreciate these are a little bit cheeky because I'm arguing that we can actually improve the rate of productivity growth and reduce inequality. For the next 4 principles, I instead will focus just on adaptation. We're going to take the rate of productivity growth that's given and work with that. And that leads to my second principle. We need to accept that hard choices about redistribution must be made. It's somewhat trite to observe that in a world of lower productivity growth, we'll have fewer resources, but I think the magnitude is worth dwelling on. Let's compare 2 rates of labour productivity growth. 2.5% a year is the rate the US saw in the 50s and 60s, or in the late 90s and early 2000s. 1% a year is what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years. In the high productivity growth world, over 10 years, total national income grows by more than a quarter. In the low productivity world, total national income grows by about 1/10. What does this imply for our capacity to redistribute? Currently, if you look at the post-tax and transfer distribution of national income, as calculated by Piketty, Sayers, and Zuckman recently, the bottom 50% of the income distribution receive about 19–20% of national income. Let's take a very simple hypothetical of what our goal might be in tackling inequality. We want to reverse the rise in inequality for the bottom 50%, which implies bringing their income share back to 25% of total national income, what it was in the 1960s, 1970s. Assuming we could redistribute perfectly, take the whole amount of national income in 2029 in the high productivity growth world. Allocate 1/4 of it to the bottom 50% of the income distribution. How much is left over? One scenario is if you hold constant the incomes of the top 10%, the middle 50th to 90th percentile can still see 3% a year income growth, coincidentally reverting them back also to their income shares of the 1970s, so fully reversing the rise in income share inequality over that period. In contrast, if we do the same in the world of low productivity growth, what happens? We give 25% of the income share of the national income in 2029 to the bottom 50% of the income distribution. That essentially means that the other half of the income distribution have to see no real income growth over 10 years. Basically, the point is that if we are serious about doing a lot to reverse the rise in inequality, if we're in a world of low productivity growth, we're going to have to make seriously hard choices about freezing or actually cutting living standards for parts of the income distribution. Resource constraints also point towards favoring targeted benefits over universal benefits, principle number 3. There's been a lot of discussion of universal basic income, universal minimum inheritances as policy responses to automation, where there's mass productivity growth, but also mass job displacement. We're actually thinking about a very different world, a world in which productivity growth is very slow. So we have very few resources to redistribute. Nonetheless, we have an inequality issue. Regardless of your innate preferences between a universal and a targeted policy, which may be to do with issues like political feasibility or the nature of the social contract, it's incontrovertible that in a world with fewer resources, some more weight should be placed on targeted policies, which can achieve the same income redistribution goals at a lower resource cost. Policy number 4, I'll argue that we should promote predistribution and not just redistribution. Predistribution is the idea that rather than just using the tax and transfer system to correct for inequalities in market income, you can actually do something to adjust the inequalities in market income directly. And I'll speak specifically today about policies that increase worker bargaining power, either through collective bargaining institutions or institutions that increase worker involvement in corporate governance and corporate decision-making. Why is this particularly important in a world of low productivity growth? It's particularly important, I think, in this particular world of low productivity growth that we find ourselves in. As I argued earlier, we can't rely on productivity growth to raise workers' pay on its own, judging by the estimates from Larry Summers in my paper. Similarly, as I've noted and as Karen laid out but in great detail, fiscal redistribution is going to be more difficult. The scope for fiscal policy is going to be much narrower to redistribute through taxes and transfers. That means if you're serious about tackling inequality, really, you have to do something about the root causes. And a great deal of research is increasingly arguing that the root causes of this rising inequality is a decline in worker bargaining power, or at least one of the root causes. In addition, if there has been this rise in market concentration and decline in competition, it may actually not involve too much of a trade-off to increase worker bargaining power. By increasing the countervailing power of workers against the rising power of corporations, you might be able to increase efficiency, or at least not harm it too much. And my final principle, for which I don't have a nice graph or picture, is that we should be sure to focus on dignity and justice alongside monetary outcomes. For a given financial cost or monetary benefit of a policy, it can either enhance or diminish the dignity and self-esteem of the beneficiaries, and it can either tackle systemic injustice or ignore it. I think, and many others I know in this room, think that it's important to focus on dignity and justice and these other aspects of non-monetary well-being in any world, but particularly in a world of low productivity growth, where we're going to have much more of a difficult time achieving our goals for reducing inequality in monetary income. It makes it much more important to do all that we can to ensure that all of our policies promote dignity, self-esteem, justice, and these other aspects of non-monetary well-being that we care about. So that's all that I have, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We will be calling up all three of my colleagues to have on the record Q&A in a moment. I am here with my author-editor hat on, to make two very brief remarks about political economy. The kinds of things that Anna spoke about, Jeremy, and Karen, of course, and Karen was very explicit about what we as technocrats, as honest economists, as good-willed people would like to see happen versus what may actually happen. And we have to think about, as we face up to low productivity growth, what would be the political side of this. And this is exemplified by Karen's statement. Her logic in arguing for targeted rather than universal benefits, for example, in a world of less growth in resources and growing inequality, is, to me, both ethically and economically sound. But we also know that politically there are great troubles in general terms sometimes when you produce benefits programs that are targeted to particular groups rather than universal. I'm not going to solve these problems in the next 2 minutes. I'm going to make actually 2.5 comments. One is we have a very provocative chapter in the book by the political scientist Daniel Dresner. Some of you read his column in the Washington Post, and he just wrote about his contribution there more eloquently than I could. And his view is that this will just, at least in the US at a minimum, this phenomenon will exacerbate the tendency of capital to, as he memorably put it, swipe right, that they will be even more eager to keep down the kinds of measures for greater labor representation and so on. I think that's entirely plausible. I think, however, people who believed that, let us say, in the late 19th century or mid-20th century also sometimes were forced into being far more socialist in an enlightened self-interest to save themselves from the pitchforks. Ideally, the world doesn't fall into either of those categories, but I think the jury is out on that. I encourage you to read Dan's argument. The 2 points I would like to make on political economy are, first, these are more conceptual, frankly, than I usually am, and I hope you'll bear with me. First is that the vast bulk of serious work on political economy for the last 30 years, in especially economics-inspired work, has been what can be called institutional political economy. Most of the writing about Europe has been about designing budget rules or monetary rules or representation devices. The work, we can talk about the whole list of authors also, as German would joke, predominantly Italian, who've contributed to this, but not solely, who've contributed to this school. And as I warned 20 years ago when the euro was about to be adopted, putting an independent central bank in Italy does not make it likely you can get herring there any more than you could before. In other words, the institution doesn't turn Italy into Sweden or Denmark or Germany. And this productivity change, I think, emphasizes this difficulty, that we have seen a massive shift in productivity across a wide range of countries with very differing institutions, and that hasn't made any difference. And so when we think going forward, there will be a knee-jerk tendency, I think, among many economists to think in terms of old solutions, which are all about rules and tweaking institutions. We may have to get our hands dirty and think in terms of very specific bargains and programs. The second point on political economy is also in part a preview of what we hope to do next at the Peterson Institute, as Jeremy and I and some colleagues have been speaking about, which is, again, to make another unfortunately apt, I think, parallel with the issue of climate change. You have a reality, and then the question is, are democratic populations willing to face up to the reality? Is it just going to turn into bitter vituperation? I'm back from a week in London enjoying the Brexit circus. This is something very real. Can any of us try to get some kind of consensus that this is the reality we have, and instead of trying to place blame, move forward given that reality? This is a very big question, but I think this is ultimately a question that we're all going to have to wrestle with, both in climate change and with respect to productivity growth. And some of our new research over the next year, we hope, will start to address those issues. Please let me call up Anna, Jeremy, and Karen to take seats up here on the stage. You can direct questions to them. This is all on the record. As usual, We have Jessica with a roving mic up front. We have a standing mic in back, and we ask that you identify yourself when posing a question, please. Thank you. Who would like to go first? Or have we depressed you all so much you can't raise a hand? Bill.
So
this is Bill Klein here at the Institute.
Right, yeah. If you thought about what would happen to inflation and prices if you had an exogenous outshift of the supply curve, you would think there would be some tendency for inflation to go down, for prices to go down. Query, I don't see much linkage so far in the discussion of inflationary pressure to the productivity growth, because in principle, you shock me with lower productivity, my prices should go up for the same reason. That's the first question. The second question is, if people worry about the debt ratio in their sovereign risk discounts, then you're going to get less alleviation from your interest rate reduction than you're anticipating. Just those two observations. I'd be interested if that strikes any resonance.
Thank you. Karen or Jeremy, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sorry. The supply shock, I thought about the inflation implications, but I did not, the supply shock seemed like a short run dynamic. And really we were thinking about the longer run. So I did not see the scope for a long run increase in inflation.
And on the second point, I basically agree with you, right? So the plausibility of which of the three debt trajectories that Karen showed for the US you should be taking seriously, which depended on how big the interest rate response is influenced by the question whether once you go beyond certain debt levels, risk premia will start to react, which would make you think that you should be worried about being on the higher trajectories rather than the lower ones. At the same time, if you are a small open economy that has, its debt on a sustainable path, you should clearly be benefiting.
Bill, let me add, if I may. I too have thought about this issue because particularly when we think about the last time we think about a major relatively synchronized downshift in productivity growth, we think of that as the 70s in the OECD, and we think of that as being one of the contributors to the inflationary cycle in the 70s. And so I've been thinking about that, and I guess where I've come out is partly where Karen was, that the central banks, in part through the accident, let's say, of the financial crisis, were not in a position to overshoot based on a falsely high productivity assumption the way they did in the 70s. And so partly it's that. It's that I think just accident's not the right word, but just through coincidence of this other factor, it was unable to repeat the monetary mistake of not accommodating again, I'm switching words too much, I apologize, overly accommodating the productivity downshift. They couldn't repeat the same mistake. The other thing I've thought about it is just, again, this relates, and this is something Anna raised and which came up recurrently in both our productivity conferences. Essentially, this is related to the story of if we're seeing displacement of workers by capital, or the robot illustration Anna spoke about, we should be seeing, yes, downward pressure on wages, but also higher returns on capital and higher unemployment and lower workforce participation, all these things, and we're not. So I just want to stress that the nature of this is somewhat different than the way you or I are used to thinking about it. And I don't pretend that I think we've got it all figured out. Just your point on the debt ratio, obviously a lot of us have been discussing and getting feedback on Olivier's AEA lecture, and I would never presume to speak for Olivier. But from my point of view, that is, in a sense, the strongest counter-argument to his point, is the endogeneity of the interest rate or the risk of a jump in interest rate to what is the level of debt. And I think he acknowledges that. I think, and again, I know you didn't frame it this way, but just to say, I think that again is where the research has to be now, is since there isn't some smooth linear function or some 100% cutoff number at which the interest rate jumps, trying to figure out when and how the interest rate jumps. But I certainly agree with you in a probabilistic way that this is possible. And going back to something Jeremy cited our co-authors on, our colleagues on, this may still further increase the relative attractiveness of emerging markets at the same time as it puts the risk that their funding costs go up. Sorry.
Fred Bergson here at the Institute. Adam, in your initial remarks, you indicated, right, I think there's a pretty widespread consensus that this lower productivity growth rate is real. It's been a decade and all. But in the book, in your introduction, you did discuss the possibility of different rates going forward. Some people think it might even be lower, but there's a group of techno-optimists like Lee Brandstetter here. You all have researched this a lot. What's your best judgment going forward? What's the probability or possibility that there might be a renewed upward jump? We've had a couple of episodes of that in the post-war period. What's your best sense going forward? Might it go back up? Are we condemned to this lower rate?
Thank you, Fred. It's a really good idea. Why don't we, because it's anybody's guess, why don't I say a few words and we'll just walk down the aisle and ask each person to contribute. But you're absolutely right, Fred. So, I mean, the points I would make is, first, and Olivier Blanchard, to mention him again, is always reminding me of this. Statistically, at multi-year periods, productivity growth in the U.S. can look like a random walk. So there's no reason to think because it's been down and there seems to be a good explanation, it couldn't just jump back up. And as I said, again, my view is we should be so lucky. I think one of the benefits of our analysis, it wasn't a foregone conclusion, is the things you want to do in case of low productivity growth don't in any way significantly change if productivity growth were to jump up. The second point I would make is, leaving all that aside and essentially contradicting it, my view, we had a very good conference. Our colleague Jeremy Cohen-Seton here was the co-organizer with me and Cheng-Young Rhee and Thomas Hebling from the IMF on the growth slowdown in Asia. And we had Joe Mokyr, the noted economic historian from Northwestern, speak, and he's another techno-optimist. I mean, you can just imagine the hallway that has Joe Mokyr and Bob Gordon in the same hallway going at it. But, you know, to really speculate from my point of view, I view it as, we got two things that lead me to think the risks are that it stays exactly where it is or creeps up a little bit only. The first is, if you look historically, when there's generally been a new technology, a next big thing, as Michael Lewis would put it, there's generally been overinvestment up front. So you think about railroads in the 19th century. You think about IT and fiber optic cable in the 90s and 2000s. People don't know which precise technology, which precise company is going to win, but the investment community usually knows that there is something there. And one of the things that has bedeviled us, and it's actually 15 years since our colleague John Fernald would put the date of the productivity slowdown in 2004, that we just haven't seen the investment pick up. And so for me, and again, not to quote him, but that's the kind of argument Robert Zellick put to me 6 years ago, that you're just not seeing the tech community leaping onto these things. And so that's very worrying. But anyway, I'm talking too much. Good, continue down the line.
So first of all, I second Adam's point that productivity growth is notoriously hard to predict. I'm paraphrasing here, but I think it was in 1987 that Robert Solow said, you can see the IT revolution everywhere but in the statistics, which is, I like to bring up that quote just because then what happened in the 90s was we did see this huge boom in productivity growth, even though we'd kind of given up hope prior to that period. I guess also to kind of reinforce Adam's point about what's going on in the tech sector, I mean, it's interesting because for all of the discussion we hear about how the robots are coming to take our jobs, it really, if you look at what's happened in recent years in terms of the data, it's not kind of shouting that story at you. What we've seen instead is we've seen lackluster investment and we've seen strong growth in employment. So, I think, that's one thing. I'm an optimistic person, and I love it when I meet optimistic people, but I think this is kind of one of the things that's really tempered my optimism. So I do think it's a possibility. The last thing I will say is just to reinforce Adam's point, everything that I said in my paper about what we should do in terms of fiscal policy, raise tax revenues, put in more incentives for saving, put in more incentives for work, make the system more efficient. Those are all things that we should be doing anyway. And I think the lower productivity growth strengthens the need for it, but it doesn't change the basic answer.
So 2 points, a pessimistic and an optimistic one. So the pessimistic one is that there is actual research showing that the marginal cost of innovation is rising, in the sense that to produce one idea, one patent, you need many more people today than 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So that essentially is sort of the flip side of the intuition of sort of this anecdotal finding of Robert Ziff that Adam quoted at the beginning. Now, this said, a few weeks ago here, Richard Baldwin launched his new book on the, what's it called? The
Robotics Revolution.
Thank you. And here he makes 2 points. So even if you take a pessimistic view on, the ability of our system to produce great new ideas, which is a little bit like saying, since Beethoven or Queen, it's increasingly harder to find good tunes, right? So it's plausible to me. However, we know there are sort of two tunes out there, AI and to some extent robotics, that sound great, but they haven't materialized in terms of enormous productivity jumps. And at least with respect to AI, there is sort of his prediction in that book is that we're going to see a lot of disruption associated with productivity increases in what he calls white-collar robots, which is basically software replacing services jobs. And if that were the case, that's something really completely new, because it would upend the sort of basic stylized facts of many decades, if not centuries, which is that productivity growth is concentrated in goods, in manufacturing, and particularly whereas the services productivity growth is much slower because, it's much harder to make people productive. You need 4 people for a string quartet. Here, the idea is at some point, these white-collar robots are going to be so good that you can actually, particularly if you do not have to see them on stage, that they're actually going to replace those people. And so if that's the case, there would be a significant shift in productivity growth. Having said that, we never know when it will come. And so in our book, we have been very careful not to say that we do not believe that the next jump will come. We will just say that it's plausible that it will take decades rather than months or years. And so we should prepare for that.
Yeah, I'll add 2 more things to what's already been said I'll add 2 more things to what's already been said on the panel. The first is that I'm a little bit more than I think a techno-optimist than we've heard so far, in that I think that it is likely that at some point we will see a big jump in productivity growth from the tech revolution. I think 2 facts have convinced me that that is likely at some point, although I don't know if it'll be 10, 20 years or very soon. One is the research by many people, including Eric Brynjolfsson, Chad Siverson, and Daniel Rock, on the J-curve of technological progress. And I think Adam alluded to something like it, which is that in every past general purpose technology innovation, we've seen actually slowing productivity growth and slowing measured investment in many cases in the first years or decades after the technology was invented. And these authors argue that we can see evidence of increasing investment in intangibles as firms restructure their production processes, restructure their intellectual property to take advantage of these new technologies, particularly things like AI. At some point then, they argue that intangible investment will bear fruit, and the measured productivity growth rate as a result can go up quite substantially. Second is the idea of whether technological progress is additive or is driven by bottlenecks. We've seen so many different innovations in the spheres of robotics and in AI in recent years. If you believe that the next general purpose technology is additive then on productivity growth, then we should see each of these innovations marginally increasing productivity growth. But if instead you need a whole ecosystem of innovations to all come together at the right time for a technology to be unlocked, and think about self-driving cars as a great example of this, where pieces of the ecosystem have been coming into play since about the 1960s, and yet it's only really now that we're seeing self-driving cars on the road because those final bottlenecks have been removed. So I don't know when the final bottlenecks towards, for example, the mass mobilization of AI will be removed, but with that model of technological progress, having a future AI revolution and productivity revolution is not incompatible with slow productivity growth today.
I have Frank Ruzinski, but first Joe Marie at the back mic, please.
Thank you. I'm Joe Marie Griesgraber with New Rules for Global Finance. And I wanted to introduce two factors that I'd like to see how you would incorporate them in your discussion. One is, yes, labor mobility, but we see that international labor mobility is very problematic, whether from Africa into Europe or, God forbid, the invasion from Mexico coming into the United States, which has no space to grow and we're overly crowded. Secondly, there are increasing activities to address money laundering and the ability of companies to put their money overseas, including a lot of new talk about beneficial ownership being disclosed, transparent. So is there any hope in either of the hope or despair in either of those factors? Thank you.
Anna, do you want to start and then Jeremy?
I think those are both super important points. I think increasing international labor mobility would be the single most powerful thing that we could do as a world to reduce global inequality. It also seems incredibly unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon, both from a political feasibility perspective and also because I think we need to have important and legitimate debates in our societies about the pace of cultural change and what national identity means and all these things that are currently being litigated here and in my home country as well. On money laundering and companies putting money overseas, I think the move to having beneficial ownership registers, transparency and beneficial ownership is extremely important. I don't necessarily see it helping productivity growth, but it might alleviate many of the challenges that we will see in a world of lower productivity growth, particularly the fiscal challenges in terms of governments actually being able to know what their companies and what their individuals are earning and their ability to tax that revenue. So I strongly hope we see more of that in the future.
So first I wanted to advertise a paper by two colleagues of ours, Jacob Kierkegaard and Gonzalo Huertas, who look at the impact of Latino populations and Latino immigration on US productivity growth. And the basic message of that paper is to the extent that, apart from tech, the United States has a hope in seeing its productivity growth invigorated, it will be because of that group, right? Because that group has more favorable demographics, but above all, because it's starting out from a lower level of human capital, but is extremely eager to raise it. And so there will be productivity improvements from the labor force side as it takes a growing portion of the labor force and as it increases its own human capital that would be beneficial for the US. So then the question is, to what extent can you extend that argument to say, open borders is the answer, is the salvation of the advanced world to slowing productivity growth? And so here, I think we cannot be as optimistic in general. So I come from a country, Germany, where there's an overwhelming case for a generous immigration policy because we have a very significant demographic problem, much bigger than here. And yet, except for Mrs. Merkel's brief moment of inspiration in 2015, there is no political willingness to allow immigration. And when you are talking about when you then get into a discussion on the economic case for immigration, you very quickly get to a point in the discussion where the other side, the anti-immigration side, is quick to cite that the economic case for immigration, even in a case like Germany, is not as straightforward because essentially the difficulties in integrating many immigrants, and also you need to be in some sort of sweet spot in order to get this productivity boosting effect, right? The ideal, what you want is something like Jacob and Gon have in their paper. So you want an incoming population that is young, that has basic skills, and that is really willing to learn, right? And so we very often get a situation where you're not yet at the threshold, like with large numbers of refugees, where they are too old, or to the extent that they're young, they lack the basic skills of even getting into the process, right? So the answer, in my view, is some sort of more porous but managed immigration.
I'll just say quickly. I think just on the more open borders point, I think the obvious point there about productivity is anything you could do to facilitate the global exchange of ideas should be good for productivity everywhere. I will say that I think one of the lessons of recent years is that when these changes happen too suddenly or too fast in a society, you can get a political backlash that then makes it really hard to put good pro-growth policies in place. And I just think that is a trade-off we have to face.
Jo Marie, so I think, obviously, I want to second Jeremy's referral to our colleagues, Gon and Jacob's paper, which was featured at a major Hispanic business conference last week, or a week and a half ago, I think. It's on our website. But just to say what Jacob said, that one can create a demographic dividend if you choose right. That's not the same as choosing on the basis of justice purely, but it comes a lot closer than the people who have very short-sighted skills points views of who should be allowed to immigrate at a given time. The more important point I would emphasize, pick up on things underlying what all my colleagues sitting with me said, is we focus this on productivity growth. And over the long term, that is what matters. But one can do things that are good for the supply side and good for justice that are not necessarily going to affect the productivity growth trend much and still be worthwhile. So we've mentioned Hispanic migration or Latino employment in the US. I would add womenomics in Japan. The long-term effect on productivity growth is probably positive, since some incompetent men will be replaced by more competent women. And on average, you're drawing from a wider range of talent. In the short run, it could actually be negative for productivity growth because you have people who've been out of the workforce coming back in. But that's not the reason you justify it. You do it because for 5 years, you can reverse demographic decline and you give more people in the society a chance to be employed. I know, obviously, you're in favor of this. My point is just that as much as one wants to focus on productivity growth, that's not the only dimension on which to evaluate policy. And I think the reasons to talk about migration or women's empowerment or other of those kinds of labor force issues the case has to be made differently. It's not because it's going to solve the productivity growth problem. The final question, over here, please.
Thank you. Frank Rubinski from Aegon. I appreciate your comments on the political economy and was curious, given this polarized political environment we have and the challenges that presents to implementation, while the list of policy reforms in aggregate might be a little quixotic, I was curious on the individual side, if you kind of break those down piece by piece, which ones would be more palatable and more likely?
Usually I end up having to be the political one, not because of insight, but because that's what I'm paid to do. No, Frank, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it is going to matter case by case. So, I mean, I liked very much Anna's box of 4 boxes of policies, and we can pick out individual ones. I featured the idea that, universalist policies may be more palatable to some and are frankly less effective for things we care about. I think this is a subject for a much longer discussion and more research. What I would suggest is, to me, the most striking surprise of the last, let's say, 20 years, without wanting to offend my colleagues from the Peterson Foundation, is that for all the talk about budget loosening, the unwillingness of politicians to spend on infrastructure and public investment across a wide range of countries is really shocking. And again, to be clear, I know the Peterson Foundation is not opposed to that. They're in fact in favor of wise public investment, just paying for it. But I mean, whether it was fighting the issues of austerity in Europe during the crisis, which many of us have some scars from, not as many scars as those unemployed in Greece, but have some scars from. Whether it's when Karen was serving in the Obama administration, the inability to get agreement on basic highway bills and infrastructure spending in the US, there's something we fundamentally don't get in political economy. Because even if you go back to the most right-wing, cynical political economy that we know, you go back to James Buchanan, the assumption is always that the politicians would love to spend on this stuff and get their name on it, and the only issue is they're going to overspend because every district wants a piece. And that's not what we've been able to go. So it is, to me, something we have to really confront, even before we get to the Blanchard arguments and the productivity arguments, why we can't get spending on public investment. And even if some of it's excess or some of it's inefficient, we are so far from the optimum in a host of countries. And again, I want to stress it's different institutions. I mean, Germany has massively underinvested in public investment, despite having, as Jeremy can speak about, and he has his own scars from those battles, from his service in the German government, in a situation where their economy's been going great. And they have a very different political economy than some of the other countries. So I'm answering your question with a question, but I would really start there. I think we have to figure out a way of getting responsible public investment politically sustainable. Now, maybe MMT times Green New Deal Green New will do something. Then the challenge is how to do that in a way that's constructive. But that's where I'd start. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for some excellent questions and comments, and thank you to my 3 colleagues, Anna Stansbury, Jeremy Zettelmeyer, Karen Dinan, to all the contributors to the volume Facing Up to Low Productivity Growth, to the Robert D. Ziff Foundation for supporting this project at a time when it was less self-evident and now is more clearly needed. And especially, again, thank you to Jeremy Zettelmeyer, whose editorial and intellectual leadership made this the success it was. This meeting is adjourned.